What if Bad Bunny collaborated with Santana? This week we'll be celebrating two artists who, each in their own way, have helped to revolutionise the role of Latin American music in mainstream popular culture. Bad Bunny, whose unique and inclusive take on reggaeton and dembow has conquered the contemporary music landscape, and Santana, whose fusion style helped to vastly broaden the musical lexicon of rock in the 60s, 70s and beyond. All that and more on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel, and then on Wednesdays follow it up with one of these companion videos where I discuss the artists and genres involved in the What If video, and also share a little bit of my creative process. The idea of the What Ifs is that each week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Nueva York by Bad Bunny, and I tried to reimagine that as a Santana-style Latin rock song, so if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster.
No, con los yankees los muevo en soto, a correr que otra vez lo sacamos al estadio.
Now, when Bad Bunny played the Super Bowl halftime show this year, I must admit that I, like probably quite a lot of middle-of-the-road white people, especially in the UK, was pretty unfamiliar with his music. I had at least heard of him. I mean, definitely remembered him from appearing on the Cardi B single, I Like It, which was a massive hit. So I was aware of his music from that, although I'd never really followed up on it. Probably more aware of him from his work in films. I definitely remember seeing him in Bullet Train and Caught Stealing as well. I'm also a pro wrestling fan, and I am aware that he's been involved in wrestling, although I don't watch WWE, and I stopped watching WWE before he appeared there, so I've never seen him involved in wrestling, but I do know that he's involved in that too. So I was aware of him as a really popular entertainer with a kind of multifaceted appeal, but beyond that Cardi B single, I don't think I'd ever heard a note of music. But like a lot of other clueless people, I watched the performance, and of course it was absolutely fantastic. Just an incredible, epic theatrical spectacle celebrating Latin American culture whilst making some fairly strong political points that came across even if you weren't following the language, as indeed I wasn't, because I don't speak Spanish. And musically really enjoyable too. I'm by no means any kind of reggaeton fan, but there was enough variety and diversity of sound in there to keep me really kind of locked in for the whole performance. So, like I think a lot of people, I did definitely gain a lot of respect for Bad Bunny as a musician and performer from that. But yeah, it's wild that someone who is such a phenomenally, astronomically successful artist could have almost completely escaped my radar as a musician. I think especially in the UK, it's possible for that to happen just because, certainly compared to the States, we have a really small Spanish-speaking population. So, although we've definitely had some pretty sizable reggaeton hits, the genre's never really caught on in anything like the same way over here as it did in the States. I think the first reggaeton I ever heard would have been, I guess, Gasolina by Daddy Yankee, which I think was maybe the really big sort of international breakout of reggaeton music, but I think it had been bubbling away under the surface in Puerto Rico for quite some time by the time that record actually kind of had its international breakout. It's not a genre I've ever known a massive amount about. It's recognisably based on dancehall reggae rhythms and with strong US hip-hop influences as well, and then obviously elements drawn from traditional Latin American music as well. I gather its roots kind of go back to the 80s when Jamaicans brought the dancehall reggae at the time to Panama, and Panamanians began translating dancehall songs into Spanish. Certainly heard that that's sort of where the reggaeton style started to evolve from. So it's got the distinctive dancehall rhythm, the dembow rhythm, as they call it, I guess from the song by Shabba Ranks, that distinctive boom, 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 boom thing that is in everything. And they also adapted the sort of toasting style from dancehall records as well, but then mixing that with more of a US style hip-hop type delivery and also more conventionally sung portions as well. And I gather it was quite a sort of contentious genre in Puerto Rico in its early days. Like with a lot of other urban music types, gangster rap or whatever, it was considered to be a dangerous antisocial music form, and there were attempts by the government to crack down on it. But nevertheless, it still rose to prominence, and it's the kind of thing where if there's a style of music the government tells kids not to listen to, they're going to listen to it twice as much. So it becomes more and more popular. Gasolina, as I say, is this massive international breakout, and it's gone on to be the sort of major form of Latin American popular music of the 21st century. Obviously colossal with Spanish-speaking communities everywhere, but also quite often crossing over outside of those markets as well, particularly with things like Despacito, which was an absolutely massive hit for Luis Fonsi. And I guess Bad Bunny's taken that popularity of the genre to an even more astronomical level. Part of what makes it so appealing, not only to established reggaeton audiences, but also beyond, is the breadth of influence that his music seems to take in, because it's not just standard reggaeton. There's also clear influences from contemporary hip-hop, but then a real respect for other Latin American musical traditions, both from the past and the present. So in addition to reggaeton, he's incorporating Dominican dembow, which I gather is a distinct Dominican variant on the reggaeton theme, but then also other forms of Latin music, hints of merengue or salsa, and then other genres too. You know, I'll do things that lean into rock, things that lean into R&B, all kinds of stuff. So there's a richness and diversity to his sound that you don't always get from other reggaeton artists. I think another thing that also has made him appealing is just that there's a genuine sense of inclusivity and progressiveness about him as well. I think, like dancehall reggae, reggaeton has a long history of being fueled by a fairly aggressive machismo, which has led to it quite often being pretty misogynist and pretty homophobic. And I think one of the things that Bad Bunny does really well is still keeping a strong element of machismo, but conveying that in a way that isn't kind of denigrating to others, which is, I think, quite a powerful development, and one that you'd hope other people will follow. Also tends to pack some fairly weighty political messages into his music as well. I mean, again, reggaeton, like dancehall reggae, has always had a political side that it can tap into, but Bad Bunny seems to have really effectively lent into that. So there's some really incisive, intelligent stuff in there too. And yeah, that Super Bowl performance may have upset an awful lot of ridiculous conservatives who were terribly upset that for once the Super Bowl halftime show was going to cater slightly more to Spanish-speaking Americans rather than English-speaking Americans. But anyone who watched both that and the preposterous Kid Rock alternative halftime show, I think it was pretty clear which one felt like a celebration of the best American values and which one felt like an absolute farce. But yeah, if Bad Bunny's his generation's sort of premier ambassador for Latin American popular culture, then his counterpart in the 1960s and 70s would surely have been Carlos Santana. As prior to the 60s, Latin American music had definitely filtered into popular culture in different ways. There'd been various trends like the mambo craze of the 50s or the rise in popularity of bossa nova into the early 60s, where the mainstream had got a little bit excited about different Latin American styles and bits of that had been incorporated into popular songwriting. But Latin music and rock music had never particularly mixed, and there are a few exceptions. Richie Valens, I guess, back in the 50s with La Bamba, and Chuck Berry had some Latin American influences that he would work into his stuff too, but it was still not a particularly common crossover to encounter. I think initially when Carlos Santana founded the Carlos Santana Blues Band, as they were originally known, he didn't particularly have the thought of making any kind of cultural crossover either. A Mexican-American guy, but I think at the time just wanted to play the blues. But over the course of the first few years of the band, those ambitions changed a little bit, and he does just start to include more jazz influences and more Latin influence into the band's set. They start to mix into their set rocked up versions of popular Latin American tracks, such as Oye Como Va by Tito Puente, which becomes one of their signature hits. So those first few albums really shook things up quite a lot, just breaking down boundaries between genres and opening up people's minds to different kinds of music. So rock fans suddenly accepting Latin American rhythms, breaking out of that strict blues rock mindset that had been so prevalent throughout the latter half of the 60s, and just seeing the broader potential of rock music when it encounters other cultures. So that kind of classic early lineup of the band had a great run of albums, where, as I say, they're mixing up original Latin tinge compositions like Samba Pati with covers of things like Tito Puente, Latin tunes done in a rock style, and then also blues rock tunes like Fleetwood Mac's Black Magic Woman given a Latin twist, which is another one of their kind of classic hits. And to be honest, they could have probably just gone on exactly in that vein and continued to be very successful. Carlos Santana, I think, has always been quite a questing musician, so as the band's continued and lineups evolved, there's a pretty constant revolving door of members. His interests also keep changing. You find him getting more into the kind of spiritual jazz side of things, so outside the band he's collaborating with the Mahavishnu Orchestra and Alice Coltrane, and that influence starts to creep into the band's music, so there's a more kind of questing, experimental jazz fusion side to a bunch of the 70s output. They tried to respond to the changes in popular styles in the 80s, kind of leaning a bit more back into a more conventional rock style, but their fortunes were kind of fading a little bit, and I think from the early 90s, although they continued to always be a really popular touring act, but there's a long spell where they just ceased recording and eventually wound up without a record deal at all. But were eventually approached by Clive Davis, who already had a bit of a reputation for signing up great legacy artists and reinventing them. So he brings Santana in, puts them back in the studio, and helps them to craft this album that's half tracks that lean into their classic late 60s, early 70s sound, and half tracks that are collaborations with contemporary artists to reassert their relevance and hopefully generate some hits. And obviously it worked tremendously well. And they relaunched the band with the Smooth single with Rob Thomas from Matchbox 20, and that's immediately a just colossal song. Follow up Maria Maria, also huge, and the Supernatural album. It's just a preposterously massive selling record. Pretty sure it dwarfs the sales of all those kind of classic earlier records, and put Santana right back at the forefront of that genre-blurring Latin rock crossover that he'd been so famous for. And, I had another few years of renewed success, more hits. Before again, the tide turns and the hits kind of dried up a little bit, but he just kept going. Has never ceased to be a tremendously popular touring attraction. A bunch of the classic late 60s, early 70s band members came together for a reunion for a little while as well. That was really successful. And he continues touring and releasing records to this day. And although in the years since Santana first broke through, other acts have successfully merged rock and Latin music as well, even now Santana is so synonymous with Latin rock that if you mention the genre, the very first thing anyone will think of is that very specific Carlos Santana guitar tone. And I don't think that will ever change. But yeah, anyway, that brings me up to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternate timeline this week, it's early 2026. Bad Bunny's been invited to create the Super Bowl halftime show, and he's very excited about it. He's planning this spectacular event, but his plans hit a slight stumbling block when one of the guests that he's invited for the performance, Ricky Martin, turns out he's unable to attend due to ill health. He was going to be one of the important centerpieces of the performance, so Al Benito is a little bit concerned about this. He's like wondering which icon of Latin American popular music he can possibly get who will be able to fill his place. He's racking his brains but can't come up with anything, so decides to just go for a drive to clear his head. So starts driving, flips on the radio, and the very first thing that he hears out of the radio is, "It's a hot one." And it's like his prayers have been answered. As he hears Smooth by Santana featuring Rob Thomas coming out the radio, he realises, that's the perfect thing. Another classic artist whose genre fusions have helped to create a place for Latin American music in the American mainstream. Absolutely perfect. So he gets on the phone, speaks to Carlos Santana himself, and Carlos is very excited about this. So at the 11th hour, Santana are on board and the whole event's back on, and the centerpiece of the show is now a performance of Bad Bunny's hit Nueva York, backed by Santana in a Latin rock style, and the performance is not only a critical smash, but thanks to the tasty guitar work of Carlos Santana, it even manages to win over some of the conservatives who were very upset about having to watch a Spanish language performance. So yeah, in attempting to convert Nueva York into a Santana-style Latin rock track, first step as ever was to get the original vocal, drop it into GarageBand, sync it up to the grid, all that jazz. Managed to do that, tweak the tempo until it felt like a bit of a kind of Santana groove. I was aiming approximately for that sort of late 90s, early 2000s Santana sound, the quite sort of slick comeback sound. So got it synced up and to tempo. There's a whole section on the end of the song that just didn't really fit with what I'd envisioned for it, so just chopped that off completely. Next thing was adding some drums and percussion. So started off with just a fairly standard rock drum kit sound and alternated, depending on how I wanted the dynamics to be, between a more straight ahead 4/4 rock beat and then a bit of a softer, more Latin tinged beat with some kind of syncopated rim shots and things, just so that we had a bit of ebb and flow. I figured with a Santana track, the percussion was going to be really important too, so it's a mixture between loops that are built into GarageBand and a few other things that I played in. Can't remember exactly what I've got on there. I think there's a cabasa, some congas, and definitely a cowbell, which all crop up at various points, and quite often they're all going together as well, just to make sure we've got lots of intricate rhythms playing against each other, which is kind of part of that signature Santana sound. And then I added some bass, nothing particularly clever on the bass, just keeping a solid underpinning going, mainly just little syncopated, sort of arpeggiated figures, keeping the harmony steady and reinforcing that offbeat rhythm as well. Next came guitar, which obviously with trying to mimic a Santana thing was going to be fairly important. I only put one guitar track on. I know he often does use a rhythm guitarist, but I didn't want to clutter things more than they needed to be. So I've just got a lead guitar on there. Kind of agonised about trying to create that Santana tone and didn't really nail it, but I came as close as I could with GarageBand's built-in simulations. But I played an SG. Into effect-wise, there's a fuzz pedal and also a wah pedal, which I've got set approximately somewhere about halfway, and it moves slightly depending on where on the neck I'm playing, just to try and keep that slightly rounded, slightly nasal tone in there, and then going into a vintage Marshall simulation. So it was as close as I could get. I think it came out sounding okay. And in terms of what I was actually playing, I'm no expert on the Santana style, but tried to just go for a mixture of some bluesy bits and some bits that lean a bit more into jazz and Latin kind of melodic figures too, and just some of that kind of offbeat phrasing, that sort of stuff. I don't think it really sounds like Carlos Santana, but I think you could probably tell who I was trying to evoke from it. Next thing, added some keyboards. So there's an organ and also piano on there. The piano, absolutely clueless about Latin piano playing, but one thing I do frequently hear on Latin American records is the syncopated arpeggios played in octaves, so I really leaned into that, got that kind of figure going through most of it, while on the other side, the organ's just kind of filling out the chords, sometimes playing more sustained things, sometimes just sort of stabbing away rhythmically. And then, as a final touch, I decided it'd be nice to have just a few horns on there too. They're not going all the way through, but certainly at the start and the end of the song, just to add a bit of extra drama and pageantry. So I think initially all playing in unison, and then towards the end I had a bit more harmony in there too. And they just rounded things off nicely, I thought. And for the video, as ever, started out by just finding some performance footage of Bad Bunny singing Nueva York in concert. Sync that up to the track. And then, because it's meant to be a collab with Santana, I needed some actual footage of Santana in there, so I found, I think it's just a performance of Black Magic Woman from a good few years ago, and just edited bits of that in there, trying to make it look a bit like they were playing what I was playing on the track. It doesn't really sync up, but you get the idea. So we got them and Benito in, and then I thought, because it's a song generally about the Puerto Rican experience of New York, I thought it'd be cool to have some footage of Puerto Rican people in New York City, and then immediately managed to find a really cool video that someone's taken of just wandering around the Puerto Rico Day Parade. I think in the Bronx possibly, but I don't know. But somewhere in New York anyway. So that was perfect. Just took a bunch of different chunks of that and just edited those in just to give that kind of authentic New York Puerto Rican experience in there too. I hope you enjoyed this one. I was quite pleased with how it came together. I think the finished product actually ended up a little bit better than I envisaged it when I started working on it. But yeah, let me know what you think down in the comments, and if you did enjoy it, please like, share, subscribe. Any of that stuff would be tremendously helpful. If there's anything you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any artists or songs or genres you'd like me to take a look at, do let me know. I always appreciate your suggestions. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I'll hope to see you next time.